The first time I opened the hatch of the submarine, the stench of rust and brine hit me like a wall, and I realized instantly that this place was not built for the living alone. I was told there were 11 strange rules every crew member had to follow if they wanted to make it back to the surface, but nobody dared to explain why. I only learned them through whispered warnings passed in the dark, and I still remember the night I broke one. It wasn't the sound of the water that terrified me most. It was what crawled out of the shadows after, and that was only the beginning. I remember the moment I was first shown the crew quarters. Rows of narrow steel frames stacked in threes lined the cramped space, each bunk with a thin mattress and a curtain for a false sense of privacy. On the wall near the entrance, a laminated sheet was bolted in place, its corners rusting from the damp. At the top of the list it read, Rule 1, never check the fourth bunk. The words looked so ordinary, yet the way the chief officer glanced away from them made me uneasy. At first I thought it was a joke, some old sailor superstition meant to haze new recruits. The fourth bunk wasn't even a real thing in the layout. The racks were numbered neatly, 3 high, stretching along the walls. Yet every time I walked down that narrow passage, I felt as if there was a space that didn't belong, a small void tucked between the third and fifth. The air grew a little colder there, and the floor seemed to hum with the vibration of the ocean pressing in. I told myself it was my imagination, but the silence of the crew said otherwise. The first night I lay in my assigned bunk, I couldn't sleep. The constant groan of the submarine's hull mixed with the dull thrum of the engine made my chest tighten, and my eyes kept drifting toward the passage outside my curtain. I thought about the first rule, and for some reason, I wanted to know why such a simple instruction mattered so much. Every instinct in me whispered that I should leave it alone, but curiosity has a way of gnawing at the mind when the hours are long and the sea is endless. During mess the next morning, I asked a petty officer about it in a low voice. He froze halfway through stirring his coffee, his spoon clinking against the metal mug before he set it down. "Don't ask about that bunk," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the table. "You don't look at it, you don't talk about it, you don't even think about it." Then he got up and left his breakfast untouched, as though even acknowledging my question had soured his appetite. I laughed nervously, but the pit in my stomach only grew heavier. That evening, I decided to take a walk through the quarters when most of the crew were busy with drills. The narrow fluorescent lights flickered as I moved down the aisle, their faint buzz masking the sound of my footsteps. My eyes counted the bunks one by one, 1, 2, 3, and then almost unconsciously, I hesitated. Where the fourth should have been, there was indeed something strange. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't occupied either. The curtain was always drawn tight, yet it seemed fuller, as though something inside was pressing gently against the fabric from within. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the thin line of shadow where the curtain met the frame. My breath felt too loud in my ears, and the air smelled faintly of brine, like seawater trapped in old metal. For a moment I swore I heard faint movement behind the fabric, not the shifting weight of a body, but something slower, like the drag of skin against metal. The rational part of me insisted it was the submarine's vibrations, but my body screamed to step away. I forced myself back toward my bunk, every muscle tight, as though expecting the curtain to rustle open behind me. That night, I dreamed of drowning, not the frantic flailing kind of drowning, but a slow, suffocating stillness, as if the ocean wasn't filling my lungs, but seeping into my veins. I woke slick with sweat, the sheets damp and tangled around my legs, my heart racing in the darkness. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the curtain of the fourth bunk shift slightly, as though stirred by a breath that didn't belong. I refused to look directly at it, clutching my blanket like a child, and prayed for sleep to take me again. The days blurred together after that, drills and duties keeping me busy, but my attention always drifted back to that one place. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became, like an itch under my skin that no amount of scratching could satisfy. I began noticing small things others seemed to avoid, how no one ever placed their belongings near that bunk, how conversations in the quarters always stopped when someone passed it, how even the bravest men quickened their steps when walking by at night. It was as if the entire crew lived in silent agreement that the fourth bunk was not to be acknowledged. My breaking point came on the seventh day. We had been submerged longer than usual, running silent for reasons I wasn't told. The air was heavy with recycled breath, the walls slick with condensation. Sleep had become restless, and I was desperate for distraction. Lying awake, I heard what sounded like a faint murmur just outside my curtain. It was not in any language I recognized, soft and low, like the sea itself whispering through clenched teeth. My throat went dry, and against every warning echoing in my head, I pulled my curtain aside. The passage was empty, bathed in dim red emergency lighting, but the curtain of the fourth bunk was no longer still. It pulsed as though something inside it was breathing, slow, deliberate, patient. My eyes locked onto the subtle rise and fall, the faint impression of fingers pressing outward against the fabric. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in my chest, leaving me frozen in place. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the curtain stilled, the impression vanished, leaving the fabric slack once more, as though nothing had ever been there. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. Finally, when my legs threatened to give out, I retreated back into my bunk, yanking the curtain shut with trembling hands. I told myself I must have been imagining it, a trick of exhaustion and recycled air, but deep down, I knew better. Something occupied that space, something the rules had been written to keep us from acknowledging. I tried to sleep, but the silence around me was heavier than any dream, pressing down on my chest like the weight of the ocean itself. By the next morning, I had convinced myself I wouldn't speak of it, yet when I met the eyes of the petty officer in the mess hall, he seemed to know. He shook his head slowly, his lips pressed in a thin line, and muttered, "You looked, didn't you?" His words made my skin crawl, but before I could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life, summoning us for an emergency drill. The timing was too perfect, and I wondered if it was coincidence, or if the submarine itself had been waiting for me to break the silence. As we filed through the narrow corridors toward our stations, I felt something brush lightly against my sleeve, though no one was near enough to touch me. The sensation lingered, clammy and cold, like seawater soaking through fabric. I turned instinctively, but the passage behind me was empty, save for the drawn curtain of the fourth bunk. Only this time, it wasn't perfectly straight. A small gap had opened at the bottom, and from it leaked a faint, glistening trail of wetness that glimmered against the steel floor. I wanted to look away, but my eyes refused to leave that dark opening, and then just before the drill alarm blared through the ship, I saw it, the unmistakable shape of a pale hand slowly retreating back into the darkness behind the curtain. The laminated list of rules had looked ridiculous when I first arrived, but after what I witnessed near the fourth bunk, my eyes searched it daily as if the words themselves might shift. My gaze fell to the second line, where it warned Rule 2, never speak. During the midnight roll call, the letters seemed darker than the rest, the ink somehow fresher, and I realized that while I had been curious about the first rule, this one left me unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. Midnight was the hour when the submarine felt most alive, and silence seemed nearly impossible when fear burned in your chest. The roll call itself was simple. Each man stood at the foot of his bunk when the alarm sounded, while the duty officer walked through the quarters, checking every face. No names were called aloud, no ranks mentioned, just a nod of confirmation before moving on. The strange part was that it always happened at midnight exactly, regardless of circumstances. We could be in the middle of maneuvers, running silent under threat of detection, or even drifting in calm waters. But when the clock struck 12, the ritual began. No one explained why, and I quickly learned not to ask. The first time I experienced it, I nearly broke the rule without realizing. The alarm sounded, low and steady, and everyone in the quarters stepped out of their bunks in perfect unison. I rubbed my eyes and yawned, almost ready to greet the officer out of habit. But then I caught the way every crewman's lips were pressed tight, jaws clenched shut as though sealed by something stronger than will. The officer's boots clicked evenly against the floor as he moved past each man, his expression blank. He looked at me for a second too long, and in that moment, I thought I heard a second set of footsteps echoing faintly behind him. Afterward, I asked one of the younger sailors what would happen if someone broke the silence. His face went pale, and he muttered that no one had done it in years. Then, almost under his breath, he added, "Not since the voices started answering back." When I pressed him, he refused to explain further, excusing himself quickly, as if afraid the submarine itself was listening. That phrase lingered in my mind, and every night when I lay awake, I wondered what kind of voices could haunt the silence of a steel coffin buried beneath the sea. On the 6th night, I nearly slipped again. The alarm jolted me from a shallow sleep, my throat dry and aching for water. As I shuffled into place at the end of my bunk, I accidentally coughed. The sound was small, but in the dead stillness of roll call, it was deafening. The officer's head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, though he said nothing. But behind him, in the line of curtains, I saw one shift ever so gently, as though stirred by something inside. No one reacted, and I forced myself to stand motionless, my lungs burning with the effort to stay quiet. That night, I didn't sleep at all. My mind replayed the cough, the officer's stare, and that subtle movement in the shadows. I thought of the second rule, of why it insisted on silence, and I realized that breaking it wasn't about discipline. It was about containment. Whatever shared the submarine with us didn't like being disturbed, and the roll call wasn't for the crew's benefit. It was for something else entirely, a head count for the unseen. The realization chilled me more than the metal walls ever could, and I understood why every man's lips locked tight at midnight. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and fear sometimes feeds it rather than starves it. By the 9th night, I found myself almost daring to test the silence. The officer moved through the rows as always, his eyes hollow with routine. I wanted to whisper, just one word, to see what would happen. My tongue pressed against my teeth, the urge unbearable, when I noticed the sailor beside me trembling. His eyes darted left and right, his lips quivering. I thought he might break before I did, and I braced myself for something I wasn't ready to see. When it happened, it was almost too quiet to catch. A single breath escaped him, a soft whimper of fear that carried no words, yet the effect was immediate. The officer froze mid-step, his body going rigid like a puppet with its strings cut. The silence thickened, pressing against my ears, until I heard it, the sound of several voices whispering in unison, low and muffled, as though they were speaking from behind the steel walls. They repeated the same word, but it was foreign, ancient, rolling like the tide. My skin prickled, and I fought the urge to cover my ears. The sailor collapsed, moments later, his knees buckling under him. No one moved to help, no one dared break formation. The officer finally continued walking, his expression unchanged, as though nothing had happened. When the alarm finally ended, the others dragged the fallen man back into his bunk, pulling the curtain closed. I wanted to ask if he was alive, but the look in their eyes stopped me. There was no relief, no urgency, only resignation. Whatever fate he had met, it was sealed the moment he let sound escape his lips. From that night onward, I noticed the crew moving differently. They avoided the fallen sailor's bunk entirely, walking around it as though it no longer existed. The curtain never moved, and no one spoke of him again. But sometimes, in the dark hours after roll call, I swore I heard faint breathing from behind it, slow and heavy, like a man trying to remember how lungs should work. My blood ran cold whenever it came, and I prayed for the morning bells to drive the silence away. But the silence always returned. On the 12th night, the whispers grew louder. This time, they didn't follow a single word but fragments of sentences, broken and incomplete, as though dozens of voices were struggling to form something coherent. I pressed my palms hard against my thighs, my body stiff with terror, while my mind screamed at me to run. But there was nowhere to run, only steel walls and endless ocean above. When the officer's eyes swept over me, I thought I saw his lips twitch, as though fighting the urge to answer whatever called from the depths. And then, just as quickly as it began, the roll call ended. The alarm silenced, the men returned to their bunks, and the officer vanished into the passageway. Yet I couldn't bring myself to lie down. My gaze locked onto the bunk, where the sailor had once stood, the one now avoided by everyone else. Slowly, with agonizing care, the curtain shifted, not all at once, not like a hand pulling it aside, but in tiny deliberate movements, as though fingers I couldn't see were testing the edge of fabric. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, and I realized I was staring at something that wasn't supposed to move. The fabric stilled suddenly, and silence reclaimed the quarters. I told myself it was over, that nothing more would happen, but then a sound seeped from the darkness of that bunk, a low exhale, wet and strained, followed by the faintest echo of my name whispered back at me. I thought I understood fear after what I had seen during roll call, but the next line on that laminated sheet carried a different kind of weight. It read, Rule 3, never touch the rusted hatch at the stern. I had walked past that hatch before without much thought. It was tucked away at the far end of the corridor, half hidden behind supply crates, its surface pitted with corrosion and streaks of salt. But once I noticed the warning, I began to feel its presence more strongly, like an unwanted gaze that pressed against my back whenever I neared it. The stern was the quietest part of the submarine, farthest from the living quarters and always colder, as though the sea itself was bleeding through the steel. Most men avoided lingering there, and the ones who did moved quickly, never looking directly at the hatch. I started to wonder if it even served a function anymore. The metal looked sealed, welded by rust and time. Yet I couldn't shake the thought that something waited just on the other side. The rule made me picture it less as a barrier, and more as a lock, holding something in rather than keeping us out. One night, I volunteered to help with maintenance in that section. The others gave me strange looks, but no one argued. The corridor stretched long and narrow, the dim lights overhead flickering in lazy intervals. When I reached the hatch, I paused. The rust had eaten deep into its surface, forming patterns that almost resembled shapes, spirals, lines, even the faint outline of a handprint pressed from within. I reached out instinctively before catching myself, pulling my hand back with a shiver. The air smelled different there, heavy with brine and decay, as if seawater was dripping unseen through cracks. As I worked nearby, tightening valves and checking gauges, I swore I heard faint sounds beneath the hum of the ship. They weren't mechanical, not the groan of metal or the churn of water, but softer, more deliberate. A dragging rhythm, slow and uneven, like something pacing just beyond the steel. Every so often, it stopped directly behind the hatch, and I had to steady my breathing to stop myself from bolting. My flashlight beam quivered as my hands trembled, and I realized I wasn't alone in that corridor. Something on the other side knew I was there. The petty officer found me later, sitting pale and shaken beside the supply crates. He didn't ask what had happened, just muttered, "You stayed too close, didn't you?" His voice carried no judgment, only a weary resignation, as though he had seen it countless times before. When I tried to press him for answers, he shook his head firmly. "It's older than the ship," he said under his breath. "Don't give it reason to remember you." Then he walked away, leaving me with more questions than comfort. From that night onward, the hatch lingered in my thoughts constantly. Even when I wasn't near it, I could picture its rough surface perfectly, as though it had imprinted itself on the inside of my eyelids. I began dreaming of it, vivid nightmares where I stood before the hatch, my hand pressed against the corroded metal, feeling something throb like a heartbeat on the other side. Each time I woke gasping, my palm tingled as though the sensation had followed me into waking life. Sleep offered no escape, only deeper obsession, The 12th day was when I realized I wasn't the only one affected. While checking equipment near the stern, I caught sight of another crewman staring at the hatch. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his body swaying slightly as though entranced. I called his name, but he didn't respond until I physically grabbed his shoulder. He startled violently, muttering that he had just been listening. When I asked what he meant, he shook his head quickly and stormed off. That phrase stuck with me, because in that moment, I realized the hatch wasn't silent to everyone. Later, during dinner, the same man didn't show up. No one mentioned him, not even the officers. I asked quietly if he was sick, but the others ignored me, staring at their plates in silence. The atmosphere felt heavy, like a secret pressing down on all of us. That night, I heard movement in the stern again, louder this time, echoing faintly through the hull. A metallic scraping, followed by a low rhythmic pounding, as though something inside the hatch was trying to remind us it was still there. Sleep was impossible, and I lay awake counting the seconds until morning. By the 15th night, I couldn't take it anymore. The sound of the hatch haunted me, growing louder with each passing day. My curiosity burned hotter than my fear, and I decided to see if anyone had ever opened it. I searched the submarine for schematics, digging through old manuals in the storage room, but the hatch wasn't marked anywhere. It didn't exist on paper, not as a maintenance entry, not as an emergency exit. It was as though the submarine had been built around it, hiding it deliberately. The discovery chilled me. Someone had wanted it forgotten, yet someone else had written it into the rules. The breaking point came 2 nights later. The submarine was running silent again, the air tense with the kind of quiet that made every breath seem intrusive. I slipped from my bunk and walked the length of the corridors, my footsteps echoing faintly in the emptiness. When I reached the stern, I stopped before the hatch, my flashlight casting uneven shadows across its corroded surface. I told myself I wouldn't touch it, only look closer, but standing that near made the temptation unbearable. The rust looked almost soft under the light, like skin, and the faint outline of that handprint seemed fresher, darker than before. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling inches from the surface. The air grew colder with every fraction of distance closed, and the smell of salt intensified until my eyes watered. Just as I was about to make contact, a sound erupted from the other side, not a scrape, not a knock, but a deep guttural groan, like the hull itself crying out in pain. I staggered back, dropping my flashlight, which rolled across the floor and flickered out. In the sudden darkness, I heard something drag itself slowly along the other side of the hatch, pausing directly opposite where I knelt frozen. For several minutes, I didn't move, barely breathing, listening to the thing press against the steel. Then, to my horror, the hatch shuddered, not violently, not enough to break free, but a subtle tremor, as if the thing inside had shifted its weight against it. My blood turned to ice, and I realized what the rule was truly protecting us from. The hatch wasn't just old metal, it was a barrier, and whatever was sealed behind it was not meant to join us. I stumbled away blindly, clutching the wall for balance, until I reached the relative safety of the mess hall. My skin still tingled where my hand had hovered near the hatch, and I swore I could feel a faint vibration lingering in my fingertips. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I tried to convince myself I hadn't really come close enough to break the rule. But when the lights dimmed for night cycle, I noticed something new. The curtain of my bunk had begun to rust at the edges. The laminated list had started to feel less like guidance and more like prophecy, every line carving its way into my nerves. After the encounter with the stern hatch, I stared at the next instruction until the words seemed to blur. It read, Rule 4. Never answer the man who knocks from inside the walls. At first, I almost laughed. The idea of someone knocking from within the steel hull seemed absurd, impossible even. But then I remembered the groan from the hatch, the whispers during roll call, and the way the submarine often felt more alive than machinery had any right to. The walls of a submarine are thin in a way most people don't realize. Not physically, The steel is thick and reinforced. But acoustically, every vibration carries. Every shudder is amplified, and sometimes you swear you hear voices where there can't be any. At first, I thought that's all the knocking was, just my mind assigning rhythm to random noises. But the first time I heard it clearly, I knew it wasn't the ship. It was too precise, too human, each knock spaced with careful intention, as if whoever was on the other side was waiting for me to reply. It happened during the quiet hours, when the crew slept, and only the hum of the engines filled the dark. I was lying awake, staring at the faint rust forming along my curtain, when the first knock came. 3 sharp raps, low and deliberate, from somewhere behind the wall near my head. I froze, my throat tightening, convinced it was a dream. Then it came again, slower this time, like a patient hand testing my nerves. I pressed myself deeper into the mattress, reminding myself of the rule, forcing the urge to whisper back down into my chest. By the second night, the knocking had returned, always near my bunk, always in the hours when silence felt heaviest. The rhythm changed each time, sometimes frantic, sometimes almost playful, like the person, if it was a person, was trying to learn my patterns. I nearly broke then, nearly asked aloud, who was there? The words burned at the back of my throat, desperate to escape, as though whatever waited inside the walls was coaxing me into answering. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood just to keep quiet, gripping my blanket until my knuckles went white. It wasn't just me though. I began noticing the subtle signs in others. Bloodshot eyes, sleepless expressions, the twitch of a man who had heard something he didn't want to believe. No one spoke about it, not directly, but there was a heaviness in the air that said we were all sharing the same torment. The petty officer caught me staring at the walls once, and he shook his head sharply, whispering, "Don't acknowledge it, that's what it wants." His words sent a chill through me, because he didn't sound like he was warning me of a noise. He sounded like he was warning me of a man. The worst was the 5th night. I had managed to drift into uneasy sleep when the knocking began again, louder than ever. This time, it came from the floor beneath my bunk, traveling upward in slow, deliberate thuds. My body stiffened, every hair on my arm standing on end, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Who's there?" The words were so soft, I thought perhaps they hadn't truly left my lips. But the silence that followed was immediate, and in that silence I realized my mistake. For the first time, the knocking stopped. I stayed awake until morning, every nerve raw, waiting for it to return. But it didn't, not until the next night. When it came back, it wasn't the same rhythm. It was faster, harsher, almost angry, and it echoed from multiple points around me. The walls seemed to close in, vibrating with furious intent, and I buried my face in my hands, wishing I could take my words back. Then faintly, beneath the pounding, I heard something worse, a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close, pressed right against the metal. It said my name. I refused to sleep in my bunk after that. I started volunteering for extra shifts, finding excuses to be anywhere else when the quiet hours approached. But the knocking followed. In the mess hall, in the stern, even in the narrow corridors, always faint, always timed with my steps. Like a predator, keeping pace just out of sight. The others noticed too. I could see it in the way their eyes flicked toward the walls, the way they flinched at sudden sounds. But none of them admitted it aloud. None dared give it more power than it already had. One evening, while cleaning equipment, I saw something that turned my stomach. Along one section of wall near the stern, faint indentations dotted the metal surface, shaped unmistakably like knuckles pressed from within. They weren't uniform, not spaced like bolts or manufacturing marks. They were irregular, as though hands had been hammering weakly, over and over, desperate to be let out. I traced one with my finger, before pulling away sharply, my skin tingling where it had touched. That night, I washed my hands until they burned, convinced I could still feel the cold imprint against my flesh. The true horror came weeks later, when I learned what happened to those who answered too much. A sailor who had been distant for days finally snapped during roll call. He whispered something into the wall beside his bunk, his lips moving frantically, though no sound escaped. Moments later, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. When they carried him away, his body was stiff as stone, his mouth locked in a silent scream. No one spoke of it afterward, but when I passed the walls near his bunk, I could hear a new knocking rhythm added to the others. A steady beat, almost like a heartbeat, joining the chorus. I tried to steel myself, to resist the pull, but the pressure grew unbearable. The knocking never ceased now, surrounding me at all times, pressing against every inch of the submarine, like fingers searching for a weak point. Sleep became impossible, sanity slipped away, and then one night, as I sat shaking in the dark, the knocking stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I sat frozen, straining to hear anything at all, but the submarine was utterly still. My relief was short-lived, because as I leaned back against the wall, something whispered directly into my ear, clear and sharp. It was a voice, deep and human, and it said, "Now that you've heard me, why won't you answer?" When I reached the next line on the list, my stomach knotted. I could almost hear the words in my head before I even looked down. The paper read, "Rule 5. If you hear singing in the flooded chamber, never follow it." My eyes lingered on that word. Singing. It was absurd, wasn't it? A submarine is a place of steel, machinery, and human voices bound by discipline. There should be no song here. No melody echoing beneath the crushing weight of the sea. Yet the way the letters seemed etched, rather than printed, told me this wasn't a warning born of superstition. Someone had written it after hearing the song. The flooded chamber wasn't a myth. Every submarine has compartments sealed away, sections sacrificed after breaches or accidents, filled with seawater but kept locked from the rest of the ship. They are the ship's graves, reminders of close calls, of those who didn't survive. On ours, the chamber was near the stern, off limits, bolted and welded, a place we passed only when duty demanded it. Still, even untouched, it radiated unease. The metal sweated condensation, the air grew cooler near it, and though no one admitted it, we all quickened our pace whenever we walked by. The first time I heard it, I thought my ears were playing tricks. I was making a late pass through the stern corridor when a faint hum drifted through the steel. At first I thought it was machinery, some frequency bouncing oddly, but then the notes sharpened, rising and falling like a voice, soft and strangely beautiful. I froze mid-step, the air catching in my chest, because no voice should have been there. My pulse quickened, and though every nerve told me to flee, my body leaned closer. That's when I remembered the rule. I yanked myself away, stumbling down the passage with my hands pressed over my ears, refusing to let the melody pull me back. When I finally reached the safety of the mess, I collapsed into a chair, my chest heaving. One of the older crewmen gave me a look, not of confusion, but of recognition. He didn't ask if I'd heard it. He simply muttered, "Don't linger near it. The longer you listen, the harder it is to stop." His words sank into me like lead. It meant he had heard it too. The song returned the next night. This time it was clearer, softer, like a lullaby carried through water. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was intimate, like it was meant for me alone. I clenched my fists, biting down on my lip, fighting the pull. It wasn't just sound. It was temptation, weaving into my bones, tugging me toward the chamber with invisible threads. My hands trembled as I forced myself to walk in the opposite direction, every step feeling heavier than the last. By the third night, I realized the song wasn't constant. It waited. It began when footsteps neared the stern, as if it could sense proximity. Once when I lingered at the far end of the corridor, the melody was faint, distant, but as I crept closer, it grew louder, warmer, more inviting. When I stopped just short of the sealed hatch, the voice shifted, forming shapes that almost resembled words. I swore it called my name. My heart thundered so loudly, I thought it might drown the song, but the melody pierced through everything. It was only when another sailor turned the corner and barked at me to move that the trance broke. Rumors spread quietly among us. A junior technician admitted he dreamed of the song, even when far from the chamber, waking with water dripping from his hair, though his bunk was dry. Another claimed he saw shadows moving through the riveted steel, figures swaying gently, like they were dancing beneath the waves. No one wanted to believe these things, but none of us could deny that our nights were filled with unease. The ship had gained another passenger, one none of us had invited. One evening, during routine checks, a sailor vanished. He had been assigned to the stern corridor, logging pressure readings. His notebook was later found lying open near the flooded chamber door, pen still resting on the page, as though he had dropped it mid-sentence. The door itself showed no signs of tampering, but when we pressed our ears against the cold metal, the song was louder than ever. Not soft this time, not delicate, but jubilant, like a choir celebrating victory. It was almost mocking, as if whatever sang within was rejoicing at its newest acquisition. The captain didn't record the loss officially. He never did with these things. Instead, the bunk was stripped quietly, belongings packed away, and life aboard carried on, as if the sailor had never existed. But those of us left behind couldn't forget. His name wasn't spoken aloud, yet every time the song drifted through the halls, we felt the absence sharpen. We knew he had answered the call. I avoided the stern as much as possible after that. But one night, I made a mistake. I was half asleep, disoriented, when I took the wrong passage. The song was waiting for me. It slipped around me before I realized where I was, curling through my ears, sinking into my chest. This time, it wasn't just beautiful, it was pleading. The voice cracked, full of sorrow, calling for help, begging to be freed. My pace slowed, my eyes stung with tears. Against every instinct, I reached out toward the hatch. My fingers hovered inches from the cold metal when I noticed something, droplets of seawater, seeping from the rivets, running like tears down the wall. The hatch pulsed beneath my hand, as though something on the other side was breathing against it. I ripped my hand back, stumbling away with a strangled cry. The singing rose sharply, almost furious now, filling the corridor until my ears rang. I ran, half blind, until I crashed into the arms of another crew member. He didn't scold me. He just held me firmly and whispered, "It's stronger when you almost open it. That's how it feeds." Sleep abandoned me after that. The song never left my ears completely. Even in the mess, even during shifts, I would catch fragments of its melody, lurking beneath the hum of engines. Once, during a drill, I swear I heard the voices of my family woven into the tune, calling my name with aching familiarity. That was when I realized the truth. It wasn't just a song, it was mimicry, shaped from our own memories, our own longings, designed to make us crack. Weeks passed, and more men began vanishing. Each disappearance was followed by a louder chorus, as though the singers inside were multiplying. No one spoke of it openly, but terror lived in our eyes. The flooded chamber had become a mouth, and the submarine, a cage. Last night the song changed. It wasn't a single voice or a chorus, it was everyone. Every lost sailor's voice threaded together, chanting in harmony. I recognized the technician, the missing sailor, even voices I shouldn't have known, voices that belonged to those who had died long before I ever boarded this vessel. They sang as one, their melody rising until the steel shook, and when I pressed my hands against my ears, desperate to block it out, the sound didn't stop. It was inside me now. The song doesn't need the flooded chamber anymore. The next line on the weathered list made my skin prickle before I even read it aloud. Rule 6. Never look through the porthole after midnight. I stared at the words for a long time, my reflection faintly shimmering across the page, and I felt an unease I couldn't quite name. The submarine had only a few small portholes, thick glass circles set into certain passageways and compartments, mostly for observation during surface operations. At this depth, They were nothing but black mirrors staring back at you. Still, the very idea that the crew had a rule against looking through them after midnight was unsettling in ways I couldn't explain. It sounded ridiculous at first. What difference did time make? Down here where the sun never reached, day and night meant nothing beneath the waves. But I'd already learned not to laugh at these warnings. The rules weren't guidelines. They were scars written into words, each one earned through loss, through encounters no one outside this steel coffin would ever believe. The first time I broke the rule, it was by accident. I was on late watch, checking gauges near one of the side corridors, when I felt that prickling sensation along my neck, that creeping awareness that I wasn't alone. My eyes, without my permission, drifted toward the porthole. It was well past midnight. At first, all I saw was my own faint reflection in the glass, layered over an ocean so dark it seemed endless. Then something shifted. A ripple of light pulsed faintly through the black. Not the steady beam of our lamps, nor the erratic flicker of bioluminescent life. This was slower, deliberate, like the glow of something alive pressing close. My breath hitched, and I leaned closer, squinting against the distortion of the glass. That was when I saw them. Eyes, too many eyes. Pale, unblinking orbs suspended in the water, arranged in impossible rows, staring straight back at me. I stumbled backward, choking on my own breath. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, the porthole was empty. Just black water and my own shaking reflection. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had stared at me hadn't gone. It had simply retreated, waiting for me to look again. I didn't tell anyone right away, but soon I noticed the others avoiding the portholes entirely after hours, walking with their heads down, hugging the opposite wall of the corridor as if the glass itself radiated heat. And then I realized they didn't just avoid looking. They didn't even let their reflections pass too close. The second time, I wasn't so lucky. A new recruit, fresh-faced, reckless, had leaned into the glass during a midnight patrol, laughing about the ghost fish stories whispered on board. I heard him shout, a sharp cry that cut through the hum of the ship. By the time I reached him, he was pressing his face against the porthole, eyes wide, whispering in a tone that chilled me. "They're waving at me." I grabbed his shoulders, yanking him back. He fought me at first, clawing to get closer, until I slammed him against the opposite wall. His gaze was wild, pupils blown wide, sweat dripping down his face. When he finally blinked, it was as though a switch had flipped. He sagged in my grip, sobbing like a child, begging me not to let him near the glass again. He was confined to quarters after that. Within a day, he stopped eating. Within 2, he stopped speaking. On the third night, someone woke screaming. The recruit had vanished. His bunk was soaked, not with sweat, but with salt water. The porthole nearest his room was wet too, streaks of water running down the inside of the glass, though no leak could be found. The officers said nothing. His name was scratched quietly off the roster, his things packed away, but everyone on board knew. He had been taken. After that, I started hearing things in the glass. At first, faint tapping, as though fingernails scraped from the other side. Then whispers, muffled but persistent, as though voices were pressing through the barrier, begging me to open it. Sometimes I swore they spoke my name. The worst part wasn't the sound. It was the reflections. The porthole didn't just show me anymore. It showed versions of me that weren't quite right. My reflection blinked when I didn't. It smiled when my lips stayed still. Once I passed a porthole and saw myself standing there, face pale, eyes bloodshot, long after I had already walked past. One night, the whispers changed. They weren't calling to me, they were warning me. "It's behind you." My blood froze. I turned slowly, heart slamming against my ribs. At first there was nothing but the long, silent corridor. Then the lights flickered, dimmed, and for the briefest second, I saw a shape gliding past the far end, long, impossibly thin, with too many joints bending in ways no human body could. When the lights steadied again, the passage was empty. No one slept easily after that. Crew whispered of faces peering in through the glass. Not fish, not human, but something in between. A messmate claimed he saw a hand pressed against the porthole, pale and webbed, fingers leaving streaks across the inside of the glass, even though it should have been impossible. Another said he woke in the night to find his reflection watching him from the opposite side, grinning, mouthing words he couldn't hear. I told myself I would never look again, that I would keep my eyes down and ignore the pull. But 2 nights ago, the song returned, the one from the flooded chamber. Only this time, it didn't echo faintly through the steel. It came from the glass. The porthole nearest my quarters vibrated faintly, as though something pressed lips against the other side, humming directly into the metal. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the tune resonated in my bones. My reflection in the glass began to sing along, even as I stood frozen in silence. When I blinked, the reflection didn't. It leaned closer, pressing its forehead against the glass until cracks spidered faintly across the surface. I staggered back in horror, waiting for it to shatter, for water to come rushing in, but the cracks vanished as quickly as they appeared. The reflection smiled at me one last time before fading into darkness. I haven't looked at the portholes since, but last night I woke to the sound of scraping on the glass, not outside, inside. As though something was trying to claw its way out. I stood at the intersection of 2 narrow passageways, staring at the laminated sheet and reading Rule 7. Never answer if someone calls your name from the torpedo room. At first it sounded like the kind of rule that only existed to scare rookies. Another superstition to keep us on edge during long deployments. But the senior crew weren't joking, and their silence every time I tried to ask why left me even more unsettled. By then, I had already seen enough to know that every rule written on that sheet was not a suggestion, but a matter of survival. The torpedo room itself was at the far end of the submarine, a place rarely visited unless maintenance or checks were required. It was colder there, the walls sweating with condensation as though the ocean outside was pressing more tightly against the hull in that space than anywhere else. I remembered walking through it once during a guided tour when I first arrived, the long metal tubes lined up like coffins waiting to be launched into the deep. Even then I felt uneasy, as though someone was standing just beyond my peripheral vision, watching silently from behind those sealed hatches. The first time I heard my name called, I was alone during a night watch. The voice drifted from the dark corridor leading to the torpedo room, soft at first but distinct enough that I froze in place. It wasn't the captain nor any of the crew I recognized. It was my own mother's voice, distant but tender, calling me the way she used to when I was a child. My heart hammered against my ribs because the sound didn't echo naturally. It carried no weight, no vibration in the metal hull. It was as though the submarine itself had spoken directly into my head. I forced myself to look away, reminding myself that answering was forbidden. My lips trembled because instinct wanted me to respond, to follow that familiar voice down the corridor. For a moment, I even took a step toward the sound, my body betraying my reason, until I caught sight of Reyes watching me from across the control room. He shook his head slowly, his face pale, and whispered, "Don't ever." That single gesture anchored me in place, but the voice continued to call my name, repeating it with increasing urgency until it finally faded into silence. Later, when the others gathered for the midnight meal, I asked Reyes what would have happened if I had answered. He didn't look at me at first. He kept staring at his untouched food, tapping his fork against the tray as though debating whether to speak. Finally, he leaned closer and said, "If you answer, it knows it has permission. And once it has permission, it won't stop until it has you." His words haunted me the rest of the night, echoing louder than the creaks of the hull or the constant thrum of the engines. I didn't sleep at all. The next incident occurred 2 days later, when the submarine was in deeper waters than I'd ever experienced before. The air felt heavier, the pressure of the ocean palpable even inside the steel vessel. That was when I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't my mother's. It was Reyes. The tone, the cadence, everything sounded exactly like him, calling my name from the torpedo room as if he needed me urgently. The problem was, Reyes was standing right beside me in the galley, holding a mug of coffee and staring at me as the sound echoed faintly down the corridor. My stomach turned to ice, and Reyes set his cup down without a word. His eyes told me everything I needed to know. He had heard it too. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but nobody dared speak. The torpedo room door remained shut, the shadows pooling at its edges like something alive. I realized then that the voice wasn't just trying to trick me, it was adapting, learning which face would draw me in faster. My knees went weak at the thought that whatever it was had been listening closely enough to mimic voices with terrifying accuracy. From that night forward, I avoided the torpedo room completely, but avoidance didn't help. The calls became more frequent, more desperate. Sometimes it was a stranger's voice, sometimes someone I trusted, and once it chilled me more than anything. It was my own voice calling from that darkened room, begging myself to come closer. I had to grip the bulkhead to stop myself from moving, my nails digging into the paint until they left scratches. The rule's purpose was painfully clear now. Answering meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant binding yourself to it. Still, temptation never left me. There's something primal about hearing your name spoken in the dark, an instinctive pull to respond, no matter how much you resist. My mouth would open involuntarily, my throat tightening as though the word was already forming. More than once I had to bite down on my tongue until I tasted blood, using pain to keep myself silent. Each time the voice faded, replaced by the groan of the submarine's shifting frame, I felt both relief and dread. Relief that I hadn't given in, dread because I knew it would come back. The last time it happened, it was worse than ever before. I was alone on watch again, and the voice began softly, like it always did. But this time, it grew louder, closer, until it felt as though it was right beside me. My own name rang in my ears, urgent, demanding, pulling me toward the sealed hatch. The urge to respond was unbearable, like holding your breath too long underwater. My jaw ached from clenching it shut. Then the handle of the torpedo room door began to turn on its own, metal squealing softly in the silence of the corridor. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with panic. The door never opened fully, but I swear I saw the slightest gap, darkness beyond darker than anything I had ever known. Just as quickly, the handle snapped back into place, leaving me trembling and gasping for air. I didn't report it, there was no point. The captain already knew, and the other crew had likely experienced their own moments with the voice. All I could do was cling harder to the rule, terrified of the day my willpower wouldn't be enough to resist. That night, lying awake in my bunk, I heard it again, this time muffled, not from the torpedo room, but from somewhere closer, as though it had seeped into the walls themselves. It whispered my name with a patience that chilled me, as though it was content to wait forever until I slipped just once. My eyes darted to the bunk above mine, then to the shadows shifting in the corners. I told myself I hadn't answered, that I was safe. But then came the sinking realization, if it had moved beyond the torpedo room, the next rule might not protect me at all. I pressed my palm against the laminated sheet, my eyes landing on the next line. Rule 8. Never sleep beside the observation window, after midnight. It looked simple enough compared to the horrors of the torpedo room, but the way it was phrased unsettled me. The submarine only had one true observation window, a reinforced oval of glass in the forward compartment, used sparingly during certain operations. No one ever lingered near it, and no one ever explained why, except for the fact that the sea wasn't meant to be looked at for too long. The window itself was strange, thick enough to withstand crushing pressure, yet it always seemed impossibly thin when you stood in front of it. The first time I saw it, I pressed my forehead close, peering into the endless dark. My reflection stared back, faint and distorted, until something moved beyond the glass. It was probably just a school of fish scattering in the submarine's lights, but even then I pulled away quickly. Staring into that depth made me dizzy, as though the ocean was pulling my mind into itself. The crew treated the window like a shrine of sorts, always avoided, always left in silence. It wasn't just superstition. I noticed small behaviors that betrayed real fear. When we passed through certain areas, the captain ordered the observation bay sealed entirely. If anyone had to enter after midnight, it was always in pairs, and always brief. Once, a rookie dozed off against the bench near the glass during a quiet night shift, and the entire crew erupted in panic the moment they realized. They dragged him out, slapped him awake, and forced him to swear never to do it again. He didn't understand why at first, but his face went pale after the others whispered what he'd nearly invited in. I didn't fully understand until my own near encounter. It was the third week of deployment, and exhaustion was gnawing at all of us. The submarine's hum was hypnotic, a lullaby of engines and water pressure that made it impossible to stay fully alert. During a lonely watch, my body gave out. I slumped onto the bench near the observation window, without realizing how close I drifted. My head tilted back, eyelids heavy, and for a few moments I was lost to sleep. When I opened my eyes, the world outside the glass was no longer just darkness. Shapes floated there, enormous and slow, as though the sea itself had grown eyes. They weren't fish, and they weren't whales. I couldn't name them at all. Their forms shifted like smoke underwater, twisting into outlines of hands, faces, and jagged teeth, before dissolving into the abyss again. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer without thinking. For a second I thought one of those shapes leaned back. It mirrored me, tilting its head the same way I did, pressing against the window as though studying me with equal curiosity. The shock jolted me fully awake, and I stumbled back, heart hammering. I told myself it was a dream, brought on by fatigue, but the cold sweat clinging to my skin told me otherwise. The rule's warning came back to me: never sleep beside the window after midnight. That was when the sea was most alive, they said, when its inhabitants roamed closest to the human world. Falling asleep meant letting your mind drift into theirs, blurring the barrier between observer and prey. I had almost crossed it without realizing. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in myself. Whenever I passed the forward compartment, I felt a tug, like gravity urging me back toward the window. Sometimes in the reflections of polished steel, I thought I saw faint movements behind me, shadows that didn't match any crew member. I began to wonder if, by dozing there even briefly, I had been noticed, and once you were noticed, perhaps the ocean never forgot you. One evening, I confessed this to Reyes, who had become the closest thing I had to an ally. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening, and finally said, "They only come when you're vulnerable. Midnight isn't the danger, it's the state you're in. Sleeping gives them a doorway." His eyes flicked toward the forward bulkhead, as though he expected the sea itself to hear him. "Whatever you do, don't fall asleep there again. If you do, you might not wake up here." His emphasis on the last word unsettled me. Here, he didn't say I wouldn't wake up at all, only that I wouldn't wake up in this world. The words burrowed into my brain, and that night I dreamed of the window again. I was pressed against it, but instead of seeing my reflection, I saw another version of myself staring back. Its eyes were swollen, pupils too wide, skin pale as the underbelly of a fish. When I raised my hand, it didn't mirror me this time. Instead, it pressed its palm harder against the glass, leaving behind what looked like frost. My double smiled faintly, as though inviting me to trade places. I woke with a scream, and for a moment I swore my hand was wet with salt water. After that dream, I avoided the observation bay entirely, but the ocean seemed determined to remind me. Once, when the lights flickered during a systems check, I caught the faintest outline of faces pressed against the glass, dozens of them, vanishing when the power returned. Another time, a crewman reported hearing soft tapping from the outside of the window, as though knuckles rapped politely on the glass. When the captain heard, he ordered the area sealed for the night and doubled the guards. Nobody questioned him. Nobody had to. I realized something then. The rules weren't just about survival, they were bargains. Each one was a thin line holding back something vast and patient from devouring us. Rule 8 wasn't warning against sleep alone. It was forbidding us from surrendering even a moment of consciousness to the things outside. Because once they gained that foothold, even for a second, they would never stop trying to widen the gap. The hardest part wasn't resisting the window. It was resisting my own exhaustion. Weeks underwater with recycled air and endless darkness grinds you down, until every muscle in your body begs for rest. More than once I found myself drifting close to the forbidden bench without realizing it. My body pulled like a moth to a flame. Each time I caught myself just in time, clutching the bulkhead, as though the metal itself could anchor me. But I couldn't shake the thought that one night, when I was too tired to fight, I might finally give in. The worst part, the last time I passed the sealed bay, I noticed something on the glass. Not condensation, not scratches from equipment. A handprint, pale, perfect, unmistakably human. It was on the inside of the window, and when I leaned closer, I realized it matched the size of my own hand exactly. My stomach turned as my eyes fell on the next line of the laminated sheet. Rule 9. If you hear a voice calling your name from the flooded chamber, never answer. The phrasing was deliberate, sharp, as if whoever wrote it knew exactly what would happen if someone disobeyed. I had passed by the flooded chamber once before, a sealed-off relic of an older design, half collapsed and filled with black water that sloshed against its metal ribs. The submarine was alive with strange compartments, but that one had an energy that made my skin crawl. The chamber wasn't part of our current operations. It was cordoned off, locked, left to rot, yet we all had to pass it when making rounds. Its reinforced door was rusted and warped, but still intact. Behind it, through the cracks in the viewport, you could glimpse the stagnant seawater inside, murky, unmoving, as though frozen in time. Some of the newer crew thought it was just another ballast tank, abandoned after modifications, but the veterans refused to even glance at it, as though acknowledging it could summon something best left sleeping. The first time I heard it, I thought I was losing my mind. I was alone in the corridor, the metallic hum of the submarine lulling me into a trance, when a faint sound threaded through the background noise. A voice. It wasn't muffled or distorted like you'd expect through a steel door. It was clear, too clear. My name, whispered low and urgent, as if someone I trusted was trapped inside, begging for help. For half a second, my instincts screamed to respond, to press my ear against the door and call back. But the memory of Rule 9 burned in my mind. Never answer. I kept walking, heart pounding, telling myself it was just the creaks of pressure twisting the metal. But when I passed again later, with Reyes at my side, I saw his posture stiffen. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge it, but his pace quickened. Afterward, when we were back in the mess hall, I asked him outright, "You heard it too, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. He just muttered, "That chamber isn't empty. Don't ever let it fool you." What unsettled me most was the familiarity of the voice. It wasn't generic. It was someone I knew. The second time it sounded like my mother, her exact tone, pleading softly. The third time it was Reyes himself, panicked, begging me not to leave him. My skin crawled at the trick, the precision with which it plucked voices from my memory. I began to dread my patrols past that section, bracing myself for whichever ghost from my past it would conjure next. The veterans whispered stories when they thought the newer recruits couldn't hear. A mechanic years ago who answered when his brother's voice called to him. They said the door had opened on its own, seawater spilling like blood from a wound. The man was pulled inside so fast it was as if he had been claimed, and the chamber sealed itself again without a trace. Only a smear of his fingernails remained on the frame. The captain never filed a report. Some things were better erased than explained. I asked Reyes why the chamber even remained, why it hadn't been welded shut or removed. He gave me a grim look, the kind that weighed heavy with knowledge he couldn't share. "It's not part of the sub anymore," he said finally. "It's an anchor. a place that doesn't belong to this vessel or this world. If we tried to erase it, we'd just make it angry. That was the first time I realized the submarine wasn't just carrying us, it was carrying things that predated us, rules written to contain them like fragile cages. One night, my strength faltered, exhaustion gnawed through my body, my mind fogged by the monotony of endless shifts. As I neared the flooded chamber, the voice came again, clearer, louder than ever. This time it wasn't a whisper, it was a desperate shout, "Help me," and the worst part, it was my own voice, echoing back at me, filled with panic. I froze, my legs locked. The sound of my own pleas clawed at me like a hook, through flesh. For a heartbeat, I raised my hand toward the door. The weight of the rule saved me. The phrasing drilled into my brain like iron. Never answer. I forced my hand back down, every muscle trembling. But the voice didn't stop. It screamed, over and over, until it cracked into sobs, then laughter. My laughter, twisted and wet. I stumbled away, ears ringing, bile burning the back of my throat. That was when I realized the voices weren't just lures. They were rehearsals, perfect imitations, preparing to trick me into believing I was saving someone real. After that encounter, I started noticing other details. The metal around the chamber was always damp, though no leaks were ever reported. When I pressed my palm to the bulkhead, it throbbed faintly, as though the chamber itself was breathing. And once when I passed its shift change with another crewman, he swore he saw pale fingers curl briefly through the seam of the door before vanishing again. His scream echoed down the corridor, and for weeks afterward, he refused to patrol near that section at all. I should have asked the captain directly, but fear kept me silent. Instead, I pieced together fragments from whispers and the terrified glances of the older crew. The chamber was a lure, a threshold. Something inside waited for acknowledgement, for permission to cross. By answering, you weren't just speaking, you were opening the door. And once it was open, there was no telling what would crawl through. What unsettles me most now is the escalation. The voices have grown bolder, louder, almost insistent. Lately, I've begun hearing them even before I reach the chamber, echoing faintly through the submarine, as though the walls themselves are speaking my name. At night when I lie in my bunk, I sometimes hear a soft knock at the edge of my dreams, followed by my mother's voice, gentle as ever, telling me to come back. And last night, for the first time, the voice didn't come from the chamber at all. It came from the bunk beside mine, whispered close to my ear. When I turned, the space was empty. I can't shake the feeling that the chamber is no longer content with waiting behind its sealed door. It's learning, testing, reaching further into the submarine with each passing night. And if the rules are right, and they always are, it means something is getting closer. When I reached the final lines of the laminated sheet, my eyes caught on words that seemed absurd at first glance. Rule 10, never swim in the emergency ballast tanks, even if ordered. At first I almost laughed. Swimming? In a submarine? It sounded like nonsense. A joke buried among grim instructions. But the way it was written, the weight of that warning, told me it wasn't meant to be taken lightly. The ballast tanks were a constant presence in our lives, though most of us never thought much about them. They kept us balanced, controlled our buoyancy, allowed the submarine to sink and rise like a living thing. Some of them were accessible through hatches for inspection or repair. Vast hollow chambers lined with corroded steel, filled and emptied with seawater depending on our depth. But no one in their right mind would swim inside them. That space wasn't meant for people. It was meant for the sea. I remembered overhearing a hushed argument weeks earlier. Just outside the mess, a crewman had been disciplined for tampering with one of the tanks. His name wasn't spoken again, and I never saw him after that day. At the time, I assumed he'd been reassigned or discharged. But now, with Rule 10 burned into my memory, a darker possibility unfolded. He hadn't been transferred. He'd been consumed. Reyes noticed my fixation when I asked about it during our maintenance checks. His eyes darkened, his voice hushed. "The tanks aren't empty when we drain them," he said. "Something stays behind. You don't want to see it." He refused to elaborate further, but I could see the strain on his face. It wasn't fear of reprimand that silenced him. It was fear of remembering. That night, curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't resist. I slipped from my bunk and traced my way to the maintenance decks where the hatches to the tanks were located. The corridors there were colder, the air tasting of rust and salt. I stopped at one hatch, the steel rim sweating with condensation, and pressed my ear against it. At first there was nothing but the faint groan of the submarine. Then gradually, I heard something else. Movement, not the gurgle of trapped water, but the steady rhythm of breathing, slow and deliberate, as though a massive set of lungs exhaled behind the bulkhead. My skin prickled. I pulled back fast, my heart hammering, and for a moment I swore the hatch pulsed inward, as though something behind it had leaned against the metal. The next day, Captain Rourke called for volunteers. One of the tanks had a suspected malfunction, and a man would need to enter it suited up, tethered, to investigate. Silence fell over the room. No one moved. Finally, the captain's gaze landed on me. He didn't order it directly, but his eyes dared me to refuse. I felt the weight of Rule 10 pressing down on me. Never swim in the tanks. Even if ordered, I forced myself to shake my head. "I'm not fit for it, sir." My voice cracked with the lie, but I stood firm. The captain's jaw tightened, yet he didn't push. Instead, he turned his glare on a younger recruit, someone too green, too eager to refuse. The boy saluted and followed the officers down the corridor. I wanted to stop him, to shout the warning aloud, but fear sealed my mouth. Hours later, whispers spread. The recruit hadn't returned. Officially, the report claimed he suffered equipment failure and drowned before they could pull him out. But Rays told me the truth in the mess that night. They hadn't pulled back a body at all. Only his tether came back, severed clean as if it had been bitten through. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the submarine creak, and wondered what had happened inside the tank. Did something drag him deeper into the flooded chambers? Did it consume him whole, or was he still alive in some impossible pocket, screaming for help we couldn't hear? The days after were worse. Whenever we passed near the tanks, I felt watched, not in the vague paranoid way I'd grown accustomed to in the submarine, but directly, like something just inches away behind the steel, was pressed against the wall, following me. Once, I caught sight of movement through a grated viewport, pale shapes shifting in the water where none should be. When I blinked, they vanished. The strangest part came 3 nights later. I was jolted awake by the sound of water dripping. Not the usual condensation, but a steady trickle. I followed it down the passage, until I found a hatch slick with seawater. The marking on the rim confirmed what I already knew. It was one of the emergency tanks. My heart froze as I leaned closer. From behind the steel, I heard the muffled sound of a human voice, not just any voice. The recruit's voice. His pleas were garbled by water, but the desperation was unmistakable. "Let me out. Please help." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. I remembered the rule, remembered the laminated words burned into my skull. Never swim in the tanks, even if ordered. But hearing him there, so close, begging, it broke something in me. I wanted to open that hatch. God help me. I wanted to open it more than I've wanted anything. But Reyes appeared at my side, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. His face was pale, his eyes filled with horror. "That's not him," he whispered. "Not anymore." The sound from the hatch changed then, shifting from desperate pleas to laughter, wet and gurgling, echoing through the corridor like a promise. We backed away, neither of us daring to turn our backs until we reached the mess. I didn't sleep at all after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face, but it was wrong. His features blurred, his mouth filled with water, his eyes wide with hunger. Now the tanks groaned louder with each passing day. I think they're filling themselves without command, pulling in more than seawater. Sometimes, when the submarine tilts, I swear I hear bodies shifting inside, too many to count, pressed together in a drowned chorus. And last night, I woke to find condensation dripping from my own bunk, salt water pooling at my feet. The tanks aren't just waiting anymore, they're leaking. Whatever's inside is searching for new spaces to claim. And I fear that soon Rule 10 won't be enough to save us. I didn't think the rules could get worse after the ballast tanks. But then I reached the line that froze me in place. Rule 11. Never answer a voice that calls you by name, from the flooded compartments. It wasn't written like a hypothetical. It was a certainty, a scenario so common the elders had etched it into protocol. The submarine had several sections permanently sealed and partially flooded, dead zones from old accidents or sabotage, deemed too unstable for repair. They were still attached to the vessel, hollow, drowned chambers clinging to us like phantom limbs. We passed their hatches daily, never entering, never asking questions. Now I understood why. At first I dismissed the idea of voices as paranoia, the pressure, the steel echoing every groan of the deep, the isolation. It made sense, people would imagine things. But my certainty cracked the night I lingered near one of the sealed hatches during a midnight patrol. I heard my name. Not just my name. It was spoken in my mother's voice. Soft, steady. Exactly the way she used to call me in from playing outside when the streetlights came on. The sound rolled out of the grated vent of the hatch, muffled but undeniably real. My chest tightened. She was thousands of miles away. She couldn't be here, and yet the voice came again, clearer, urgent. Come here, it's safe. Every instinct told me to answer. My throat burned with the need to reply, to whisper, to acknowledge her presence, but the words on the laminated sheet screamed louder in my mind. Never answer. Never. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself into silence. The voice shifted when I resisted. It deepened, the maternal sweetness curdling into something else. It still called my name, but now the syllables were stretched, wrong, as if someone with too many teeth were trying to form them. I backed away, my boots slipping on condensation, until the hatch was out of sight. The next morning, I asked Reyes about it. His face blanched, and without a word he led me to a corner of the mess where no one could overhear. He told me the story of another recruit, long before I'd arrived. The man had been called to by his dead sister. He swore up and down that it was real, that she was waiting for him just beyond the sealed hatch. He answered. He whispered back. The next day he was gone. Not missing. Gone. His bunk empty. His clothes neatly folded as if he'd undressed before vanishing. And yet, the hatch he'd lingered near showed no sign of being opened. They don't take you in front of us, Reyes said, his voice shaking. They wait until you're alone. Once you answer, you're marked. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him it was superstition, a sailor's ghost story stretched over decades of claustrophobia. But I couldn't forget the way my mother's voice had melted into something inhuman. It hadn't been imagination. It had been bait. For days I avoided the compartments, timing my patrols to steer clear of them, but the submarine is a labyrinth, and fate seems to conspire against the cautious. One evening, after a systems check, I took a wrong turn down a dim corridor and found myself face to face with a flooded hatch. This time, it wasn't my mother, it was Reyes. His voice called my name, calm and familiar, as though he were standing just behind the steel. I froze. He'd been in the mess when I left. He couldn't be here, and yet, the voice insisted. Open the hatch. I need your help. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I remembered the rule. Don't answer. Don't even acknowledge. I gritted my teeth and turned away. That's when the voice sharpened, crueler. You left me to drown. I nearly broke. The guilt clawed at me. The ballast tank recruit. The boy I hadn't saved. It knew. The thing behind the hatch knew, and it used the memory like a knife. I ran, the echo of Reyes's voice chasing me down the corridor until I stumbled back into the mess, pale and shaking. Later that night, I told the real Reyes what had happened. He looked at me with pity, like a man who'd carried the same burden. "They learn your guilt," he whispered. "They dig into it. That's how they get answers out of the weak." The submarine groaned louder with each passing day, as though the weight of the ocean pressed harder against us. And with the groaning came more voices. Not just one or two, dozens. Sometimes they called from behind multiple hatches at once, weaving a chorus of loved ones, dead friends, and forgotten faces. They never stopped using names. One night, the voices grew bolder. They weren't content to whisper from the sealed compartments. They began seeping through the ventilation shafts, slithering into the sleeping quarters. I lay in my bunk, sweating, listening as the sound of my own father's voice filled the dark above me. He'd been buried for years, but now he called down gently, coaxing me to answer. "Son, it's so dark here. Talk to me." I buried my head under the pillow, trembling, refusing to speak. Across the room, another crewman wasn't so strong. I heard him whisper a response, too low to catch the words. The voices stopped immediately, like predators silencing their hunt once prey is caught. By morning, his bunk was empty. Captain Rourke didn't ask questions. He never did when someone vanished. Instead, new names were assigned to patrol duty, as if the missing had never existed. But I saw the fear in his eyes, the way his hand shook when he wrote the assignments. Even he wasn't immune. Last night was the worst. I woke to find condensation dripping from my ceiling again, but this time it wasn't just water. The droplets were warm, tinged with the faint scent of iron. I looked up and saw the outline of a face pressed against the metal above me, its mouth moving soundlessly. Then the voice filled the room, not through ears, but through the bones of my skull. It wasn't my family, or a lost crewman. It was me, my own voice, whispering my name over and over, begging me to reply. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The rules are clear, but the voices are clever. They're patient, and now they're learning to sound like me. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.